The Duke's Last Gambit. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Intrigue. The letter arrived on a damp Thursday morning, just as Jane Parsons was finishing her second cup of tea. There was an elegant monogram embossed on the wax seal, an ornate H crowned by laurel leaves. She turned the envelope in her hands, her keen eyes scanning the fine cream-coloured paper. The stationery alone spoke of wealth, but it was the trembling hand in which her name was written that caught her attention. A person of high station, accustomed to poise, had written this in haste, or perhaps in fear. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "My dear Miss Parsons, I hope this letter reaches you in good health. I write with a matter of some urgency, though I must confess I hesitate to put too much into writing. This coming weekend, my brother, Duke Percival Harrington, is hosting a gathering at our family estate, Harrington Hall. It is to be an occasion of great revelry, but I fear a shadow lingers over it. I cannot explain more here, but I would be most obliged if you would attend as my guest. Your discretion is paramount. Most sincerely, Lady Eleanor Harrington." Jane sipped her tea thoughtfully. It was a curious invitation. No mention of a crime, no details of a threat, only an ambiguous fear that hung over the weekend like a storm yet to break. She had met Lady Eleanor once before at a charity event in London. The woman had been poised and graceful, but there had been a sharp intelligence behind her eyes, a mind that saw beyond idle society gossip. If Lady Eleanor had taken the trouble to seek her out, there must be something truly amiss. The name Harrington was not one to be taken lightly. The family was among the most powerful in England, their lineage stretching back to knights of the realm, their influence in Parliament, business, and even foreign affairs. The Duke himself was known as an eccentric man, passionate about collecting rare antiquities and hosting elaborate gatherings. If something was troubling Lady Eleanor, it was unlikely to be trivial. Jane placed the letter on her desk and considered. A weekend at a grand estate, mingling with aristocrats and their secrets, was not how she had planned to spend her time. However, something in the letter, perhaps the hesitance, the unspoken worry, stirred her curiosity. She reached for her pen and drafted a reply. 2 days later, Jane arrived at Harrington Hall just as the October sky turned from gold to deep indigo. The estate was everything she had imagined, vast, imposing, and entirely too extravagant. Torch-lit lanterns flickered along the stately columns, and footmen in crisp uniforms stood at attention, ready to greet the guests. As Jane stepped down, the air carried the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The estate stretched for miles, flanked by well-manicured hedges, a shimmering lake, and a sprawling maze garden she would very much like to avoid after dark. A butler with an air of quiet authority appeared at the door. "Miss Parsons, I presume?" "You presume correctly," Jane replied, handing him her small travel bag. "This way, madam." The interior of the house was no less impressive. The great hall was lined with oil portraits of grim-faced ancestors, their eyes following her as she passed. The marble floor gleamed, reflecting the light of a massive chandelier. Servants glided silently between rooms, attending to last-minute preparations for what promised to be an extravagant affair. Lady Eleanor awaited her in a private sitting-room near the drawing-room. She was as poised as Jane remembered, though tonight a faint tension lined her face. Dressed in a midnight blue evening gown, she looked every bit the noblewoman, but when she stood to greet Jane, her grip was firm, urgent. "I am relieved you came," Lady Eleanor said, pressing Jane's hands briefly before motioning for her to sit. "I must admit, your letter intrigued me," Jane replied, lowering herself onto an elegant chaise lounge. "You were rather cryptic." Lady Eleanor exhaled, as though steadying herself. "I had to be. My brother has planned this gathering for months. It is to be the grand unveiling of his latest obsession, an extraordinary diamond chess set known as the Duke's Gambit. It is priceless, Miss Parsons, and my brother intends to put it on display before a select audience of aristocrats and dignitaries. Jane arched an eyebrow. And you fear someone intends to steal it? I fear something far worse. Eleanor leaned forward. My brother has made enemies, Miss Parsons, some within our own ranks, some outside of it. There have been unsettling incidents in the past few weeks. A break-in at the estate, nothing stolen, but drawers rifled through. A threatening letter left on my brother's desk. The servant's whisper of figures seen on the grounds at night. And last week, my brother's prized hound was found dead, poisoned. Jane frowned. Has he received any direct threats? Eleanor hesitated. Number not, outright. But Percival brushes it all off as paranoia. He insists the chess set will be the centrepiece of his legacy. I, however, cannot shake the feeling that something terrible is about to happen. Jane studied the woman before her. Who will be in attendance this weekend? She asked. The usual assortment of the aristocracy, Eleanor replied, lips tightening. Lord Edward Pembroke, my brother's heir, and the man who would take his place should anything happen to him. Mr. Henry Caldwell, a businessman with whom my brother has some financial entanglements. Madame Celeste Beaumont, a woman of dubious reputation, but an intimate acquaintance of my brother's. Count Vasily Orloff, a Russian diplomat with an interest in rare artifacts. And my cousin, Lionel Harrington, who has never hidden his resentment toward my brother's position. Jane noted the way Eleanor said each name with a different degree of distaste. 5 guests, 5 potential players in a game not of chess, but of danger. I assume you would like me to observe discreetly, Jane asked. Yes, Eleanor said. You will be my guest. Say you are an old friend here for the weekend. But I need your eyes and your instincts, Miss Parsons. Something is not right, and I fear we have very little time before we find out exactly what. Jane gave a slow, thoughtful nod. Then I shall have to watch carefully, Lady Eleanor, and I shall have to be ready to make the right move before someone else does. Eleanor exhaled with relief. Then let the game begin. Chapter 2. The Duke's Gambit. The grand dining hall of Harrington Hall was a spectacle of aristocratic excess. Gilded chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, their flickering glow reflecting off polished mahogany and gleaming silverware. The long dining table, adorned with an extravagant display of crystal decanters and embroidered napkins, stretched nearly the length of the hall. The air was heavy with the rich aromas of roasted duck, spiced parsnips and aged wine, mingling with the soft murmur of conversations carried on in refined, practised tones. Jane sat near the end of the table, content to observe rather than indulge in the insipid flattery that these gatherings often encouraged. As a private investigator among the upper crust of England, she was used to playing the role of an outsider, invited but never truly belonging. Across from her, Lady Eleanor maintained an air of poised grace, though Jane noted the occasional nervous glance she cast toward her brother, Duke Percival Harrington, who sat at the head of the table like a monarch surveying his court. The Duke was a man of contradictions. His presence was both commanding and careless, as though the world was a chessboard, and he alone dictated its moves. His silver-streaked hair was still thick, his face lined with the years, but sharp with wit and indulgence. He was the kind of man who had never known hardship, and yet, beneath his jovial exterior, there was something else, something calculating. The room was filled with notable guests. Lord Edward Pembroke, the Duke's nephew and heir, sat 2 seats down, his well-tailored suit doing little to hide the rigid tension in his shoulders. A serious-looking man in his early 30s, Edward had the air of someone who took life far too seriously. He had spoken little, but his gaze frequently flickered to the Duke as though measuring his every word. Beside him was Henry Caldwell, a man whose round frame and ruddy complexion suggested he was more accustomed to counting coins than engaging in aristocratic niceties. He was a businessman, one of the few non-titled guests, and though he laughed heartily at the Duke's jokes, Jane could see a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Further down the table, Madame Celeste Beaumont, a woman with a reputation as dubious as her past, swirled her wine with lazy amusement. Dressed in deep crimson with a black lace choker, she exuded a theatrical flair that drew both admiration and suspicion. Her dark eyes flicked between the guests with an expression of quiet amusement, as though she alone was privy to some grand joke. At her side was Count Vasily Orlov, the Russian diplomat, who had the expression of a man permanently unimpressed by his surroundings. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed, yet there was an undeniable air of menace about him. He had barely spoken, but when he did, his words were clipped, deliberate. And lastly, Lionel Harrington, the Duke's cousin, lounged in his chair with the kind of ease that only the truly idle could master. He had the sharp cheekbones and cold smirk of a man who thought himself untouchable. While the others engaged in the evening's pleasantries, Lionel seemed to observe it all with a detached amusement, sipping his brandy as though he were watching a stage play. It was among this company that the Duke finally cleared his throat, drawing attention to the main event of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his voice carrying through the hall, "I thank you all for joining me on this most auspicious occasion. As you know, my love for collecting the rare and the remarkable has led me to many an adventure, but tonight I reveal to you the crown jewel of my collection, the Duke's Gambit." At his signal, 2 footmen wheeled in a velvet-draped display case. As the cover was pulled back, a collective murmur rippled through the guests. The chess set was a masterpiece. The board itself was crafted from ebony and ivory, inlaid with gold filigree, but it was the pieces that stole the breath away. Each one was sculpted from pure diamond, cut with such precision that they caught and refracted the candlelight, casting small, shimmering rainbows onto the table. The kings and queens were adorned with tiny rubies, the knights sculpted into rearing stallions, and the pawns, though smallest of all, gleamed with a quiet brilliance. Jane noted the reactions around the room. Lord Edward's fingers tightened around his wineglass. Caldwell's eyes widened greedily, while Madame Beaumont leaned forward, appraising the set with the practised gaze of a connoisseur. Count Orloff gave a small, unreadable nod, while Lionel simply smirked as though unimpressed. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the Duke mused, tracing a finger along the board's edge. "A relic of my family's legacy. And, my friends, for one night only, I invite you to witness its brilliance." "You intend to leave it on display?" Jane asked lightly. The Duke turned his sharp gaze to her. "Of course. It shall remain here in the hall, locked within this case, where all may admire it." "That's rather daring of you," she commented. "A man of my stature does not fear thieves, Miss Parsons," the Duke chuckled. A curious statement. Jane had met many men who thought themselves untouchable. More often than not, they were proven wrong. Lord Edward cleared his throat. "Uncle, if I may, would it not be wiser to keep it stored securely? This chess set is worth a fortune." The Duke waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense, Edward. You worry too much." Madame Beaumont's lips curled into a smirk. "But of course, the Duke has nothing to fear. No one would dare cross a man of such influence." There was a faint mocking note to her voice, but the Duke ignored it. Count Orloff finally spoke, his voice slow, deliberate. "Such a treasure invites admiration, yes, but also danger. You are certain there have been no threats?" The Duke merely laughed. "My dear Count, you must not mistake caution for paranoia. This house is secure and my staff are loyal. Now let us put aside such concerns and enjoy the evening." The conversation turned to lighter topics: horses, politics, the latest scandal in London. But Jane watched carefully. One of these guests wanted something, and she intended to find out what. Chapter 3. A Fatal Checkmate. The household was roused by a scream. For a moment, Jane lay in the grand guest room, her mind hovering in the space between sleep and wakefulness. Then, as the scream faded into echoes down the corridors of Harrington Hall, she was up, her instincts propelling her into action. She pulled on her robe, slipped her feet into her shoes, and unlatched her door. The hallway beyond was dimly lit. Other doors were opening now, confused voices murmuring, feet shuffling against carpet. Jane strode toward the commotion. At the far end of the corridor, near the grand staircase, a housemaid stood trembling, her hands clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Beside her, a butler attempted to steady her, though his own face was ghostly pale. "What happened?" Jane demanded. The butler swallowed. It's the Duke, Miss Parsons, in his study." Jane wasted no time. She descended the stairs 2 at a time, her mind already racing through the possibilities. Lady Eleanor appeared from another corridor, her silk nightgown flowing behind her, her face drained of colour. "The scream!" she began, but Jane was already moving past her. The study doors stood slightly ajar. Jane pushed them open fully, and the scene before her came into focus with chilling clarity. Duke Percival Harrington sat slumped over his grand mahogany desk, his body eerily still. A single lamp flickered in the corner, casting a weak golden glow over the room. But it was what lay before him that made Jane's breath catch. A chessboard was positioned on the desk, mid-play, the pieces arranged as though a game had been interrupted. The Duke's head rested upon the board, his right hand curled around a single piece, the White King. His expression was frozen in a grotesque grimace, lips slightly parted as though he had tried to speak before his last breath. Jane stepped closer. The moment she did, she detected the faint yet unmistakable scent of almonds. "Cyanide." "God help us," came Lady Eleanor's whisper behind her. By now the other guests had arrived. Lord Edward pushed his way through, his eyes widening in horror. "Uncle!" He rushed forward but halted abruptly, seeming to sense, even before Jane spoke, that his uncle was beyond saving. Henry Caldwell let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." Madame Celeste Beaumont, dressed in an opulent silk robe, simply raised an eyebrow. How very dramatic. Count Orloff, standing near the doorway, took in the scene with a sharp, calculating gaze. Lionel Harrington, meanwhile, let out a long, slow breath before muttering, "About time." Jane turned sharply toward him. "You don't seem particularly shocked." Lionel gave her a lazy smile. "Oh, I'm shocked, just not distraught." Lady Eleanor's eyes flashed with fury. "Show some decency, Lionel." "Decency? Toward Percival?" Lionel scoffed. "Please, let's not pretend he was a saint. Half the people in this house would have had reason to wish him dead." His words cast a heavy silence over the room. Jane turned back to the Duke's body. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no smeared ink on the desk. It appeared as though he had been sitting here, alone, playing his own game of chess, until death had come for him. Then Jane's eyes flickered toward the display case in the corner of the room, the case where the Duke's Gambit had been kept. But the case was empty. "The chess set," she murmured, turning to Lady Eleanor. "It was supposed to be locked away after dinner, wasn't it?" "Yes," Eleanor breathed, her face pale. "I gave the order myself. After the guests had admired it, the butler was to secure it in the strong room." Jane gestured to the board in front of the Duke. "Then explain to me how there's a game set up here?" A ripple of unease passed through the room. Lord Edward's brow furrowed. Wait, are you saying that? Jane nodded grimly. The Duke's Gambit was stolen at some point between dinner and the Duke's death. This board, this isn't the real set. Caldwell exhaled slowly, which means someone must have replaced it with an ordinary set to make it look like the Duke had been playing all along. Madame Beaumont tapped a painted nail against her lips. How very theatrical. Lady Eleanor turned to Jane, her voice strained. But why? Why go through the trouble of replacing the board? Jane studied the pieces carefully. Then she noticed something odd. The game was mid-play, but one move stood out. The Duke had captured a black queen and placed it to the side, and in his clenched hand, the white king. Had the Duke, in his final moments, tried to leave a message? Jane turned to the guests. We need to search the house. If the chess set is still here, we'll find it. If not, someone managed to slip away with it while the Duke was dying. Lionel sighed. Ah, yes, a good old-fashioned hunt for stolen treasure. Just what this evening needed. Lady Eleanor ignored him. Miss Parsons, you suspect one of us? Jane's eyes met hers. Your brother was poisoned. The Duke's Gambit has vanished. We are in a locked estate, with only the people in this room as witnesses. Yes, Lady Eleanor, I suspect all of you. A tense silence fell over the room. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck midnight. Chapter 4. The Aristocratic Masquerade. The great house of Harrington Hall, once a scene of aristocratic grandeur, was now shrouded in the heavy silence of suspicion. The guests had been confined to the drawing-room at James's insistence, while the staff hurried about in nervous whispers, trying and failing to pretend that the Duke's murder had not rattled the very foundation of the estate. She paced slowly before the fireplace, her hands behind her back, taking stock of the people before her. Each of them had been polished, poised, and self-assured at dinner. Now, stripped of their composure by the dark reality of murder and theft, their true natures began to seep through the cracks. Lord Edward Pembroke stood near the drinks cabinet, his hand gripping a half-filled glass of brandy, his knuckles white. His posture, though rigid, betrayed the weight of something unspoken. Had he truly been concerned for his uncle's well-being, or was it his inheritance that now occupied his thoughts? Henry Caldwell had settled into an armchair with an air of reluctant patience. He was the kind of man who measured his life in numbers, and murder had no place in his calculations. Yet, despite his outward annoyance, Jane could see a nervous sheen on his brow. Madame Celeste Beaumont, reclining on the chaise lounge, had adopted an expression of amusement, as though the evening's grim developments were merely part of an elaborate game. She swirled the wine in her glass lazily, casting sidelong glances at Jane with a fox-like curiosity. Count Vasily Orlov stood near the window, his gaze fixed on the darkened gardens beyond. His presence in this affair was an enigma. What interest did a Russian diplomat have in an English noble's chess set? More importantly, did that interest extend to murder? And Lionel Harrington? Well, he had done nothing but smirk since the moment the body was discovered. Jane clasped her hands together. Now that we've had a moment to collect ourselves, she said, her voice calm but authoritative, let us begin with the most pressing question. Who among you last saw the Duke alive? Edward cleared his throat. That would be me. I spoke to him briefly after dinner, just before he retired to his study. He seemed in good spirits. Did he mention playing chess? Edward frowned. Number. In fact, he mentioned nothing about keeping the Duke's Gambit out in the open. He assured me it would be locked away. And yet, Jane mused, it wasn't. Lady Eleanor interjected. I saw him shortly after Edward around 10 o'clock. He was drinking brandy and muttering about strategy, but he never mentioned actually playing. And when did you last see the chess set? "The moment the butler took it from the dining hall to be stored," Eleanor answered. "He assured me it was being placed in the strong room." Jane turned to Caldwell. "And you?" The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "After dinner, I went to the smoking room. I didn't see the Duke again." Celeste smiled faintly. "I saw him. In passing," she said, her voice like silk. "Around 10:30, he was walking toward his study. He looked pleased with himself." Jane tilted her head. "Pleased?" Madame Beaumont shrugged. "Like a man who had just bested an opponent." Jane filed that detail away. If the Duke had been pleased, it meant he had reason to be. Had he solved some puzzle of his own? Or had he caught someone in a game they didn't know they were playing? She turned next to Count Orloff, who had been observing the exchange in silence. "And you, Count? Did you see the Duke?" The Russian turned slowly, his face impassive. "No," he said simply. Jane arched an eyebrow. "Strange. I saw you leaving the hallway near his study shortly before the commotion." The Count did not flinch. "I was admiring the artwork." "Ah." Jane allowed the answer to linger in the air, testing its weight. Then she turned to Lionel, whose perpetual smirk had yet to fade. "And you? Where were you while your dear cousin was being poisoned?" Lionel exhaled, stretching lazily. "Drinking, of course. And might I remind you, dear Miss Parsons, that I am not the only one who disliked Percival." "Oh, I have no doubt of that," Jane studied him. "And yet, of all the guests here, you seem the least surprised." "Because I'm not," Lionel chuckled. "Someone was bound to kill him eventually." Jane leaned forward. "Perhaps. But what I find most interesting is that someone not only murdered him, but also stole the Duke's gambit." That silenced the room. "Ah," Caldwell muttered. "Yes, the bloody chess set." Jane turned to Eleanor. "Are you certain it was placed in the strong room?" "Yes. And yet it was not there when the Duke was found." Edward frowned. "Then the theft must have happened before the murder." "Precisely." Jane nodded. The real Duke's gambit was already missing when the Duke sat down at his desk, which means two things. First, that someone in this house had the ability to remove it unseen, and second, someone went to the trouble of replacing it. A ripple of unease passed through the group. "Why?" Lady Eleanor whispered. "Why replace it?" Jane's gaze flicked toward the board. "Because they needed the scene to look a certain way. If the Duke was poisoned over a game, then his opponent must have been here with him." Lionel snorted. "So what? The killer staged a fake match to confuse everyone?" Jane tilted her head. "Or to send a message." She turned back to the board. The Duke's final move had been clear. He had captured the Black Queen, and yet he had died holding the White King. Jane ran her fingers along the edge of the piece, thoughtful. What was Percival trying to say? Chapter 5. The Pawn's Betrayal. Jane stood by the mantelpiece, staring into the flames, her mind methodically sorting through the puzzle before her. A murder, a theft, a staged chess game, and a dead man clutching the White King. A move made in desperation, or a message from the grave? Behind her, the guests had gathered once more, but the civility of their earlier conversations had given way to unease. The weight of suspicion had settled on them all. Lady Eleanor sat stiff-backed on a velvet settee, her hands clasped tightly together as though she were in silent prayer. Lord Edward stood near the drinks cabinet, a glass of untouched brandy in his grip. Henry Caldwell was pacing, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor. Madame Celeste lounged in her usual manner, but there was a sharpness in her gaze now, as though she were watching a performance she did not entirely enjoy. Count Orloff, impassive as always, remained near the window, his dark eyes fixed on the rain-soaked gardens beyond. Lionel Harrington had positioned himself casually by the bookshelf, thumbing through a volume with a smirk that had not once left his face. Jane turned to face them. The Duke's Gambit is missing, that much is clear, but what is not clear is who took it, when, or why. Caldwell snorted. Well, that's rather the whole case, isn't it? Jane ignored him. We know the chess set was stolen before the Duke's death. That means the theft and the murder are almost certainly connected. And yet, the Duke sat at his desk with a completely different chess set before him. That means one of two things. Either the murderer wanted us to believe the Duke was playing a game before he died, or the Duke himself set the board up. Edward frowned. But why would he set up a fake board? Jane exhaled slowly. Perhaps because he knew the real one was missing. Perhaps because he realized what was happening too late. Perhaps... She let her eyes drift over the guests. Because he was trying to tell us something. A long silence stretched between them. Then Lionel chuckled. Tell me, Miss Parsons, do you always take such delight in making people uncomfortable? She arched an eyebrow. Only when they deserve it. Lionel smirked. Before Jane could respond, a noise echoed from the hallway beyond. A quick shuffle of footsteps, then the sound of a heavy thud. Every head turned. Jane was the first to move. She strode toward the doors and stepped into the corridor, the others following close behind. A footman lay sprawled at the base of the staircase, groaning in pain, his cap having tumbled from his head. Jane crouched beside him. What happened? The man clutched his side, his breathing shallow. I was going to check the servants' quarters when I saw someone. Jane's pulse quickened. Who? The footman swallowed hard. I didn't see their face, but they were near the strong room. A ripple of tension passed through the group. Jane stood abruptly. The strong room. The stolen chess set had supposedly never made it there. If someone had been snooping around. Without another word, she strode down the corridor, her footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Lady Eleanor and the others hurried after her, their whispers barely audible. When Jane reached the strong room door, she found it slightly ajar and stepped inside. It was a small chamber designed for storing valuables. A heavy iron safe sat against the wall, its door still firmly locked. Shelves lined the room, holding jewellery boxes, ledgers, and silverware wrapped in velvet. Everything appeared untouched. But on the floor, something gleamed in the lamplight. Jane bent down and picked it up. A pawn. A single white pawn, carved from pure diamond. The real Duke's Gambit had been here. And now, someone had tried to move it. Lady Eleanor's voice was tight with alarm. Miss Parsons, what does this mean? Jane straightened, her fingers curling around the pawn. It means the chess set never left Harrington Hall. It was hidden somewhere in this house all along. A cold realization dawned on her then. Someone had stolen the set, someone had hidden it, and now someone was trying to retrieve it. She turned to the footman. Did you hear anything before you fell? The young man hesitated. There was a whisper, a voice, someone muttering under their breath. Jane narrowed her eyes. A man or a woman? The footman swallowed. I think it was a man. A shadow passed over the faces in the room. Jane looked at each of them in turn. Edward, Caldwell, Lionel, Orloff. Which of them had tried to slip away unnoticed? Madame Celeste cleared her throat, drawing Jane's attention. A pawn, she murmured, eyes glinting. How poetic! The most insignificant piece on the board, yet in the right hands it can change the course of the game. Jane turned the pawn over in her fingers. Yes, she murmured, but whose game are we playing? Chapter 6. A Move in the Dark. A storm had settled over Harrington Hall, the wind howling against the stone walls like a restless spirit. Jane Parsons held the diamond pawn between her fingers, its facets gleaming under the flickering candlelight. It was a message left behind either by mistake or design. She turned back to the footman, who was still pale from his fall. "You said you heard someone whispering before you were pushed?" The young man nodded shakily. "Yes, miss, I couldn't make out the words, but it was hurried, like someone was arguing with themselves." Jane's gaze swept over the assembled guests. A man's voice. That narrowed it down. Lord Edward Pembroke, Henry Caldwell, Count Vasily Orlov, Lionel Harrington. Each of them was staring at the pawn in her hand, though their expressions varied. Caldwell's eyes darted nervously, Orlov remained impassive, Edward looked troubled, and Lionel, ever the rogue, only smirked. "Let's be clear," Jane said evenly. "Someone in this house stole the Duke's Gambit. They had access to the strong room, they knew where to hide it, and tonight they came back for it. But they were interrupted and left this behind." She held up the pawn. "This means our thief, and likely our murderer, is among us." The room was silent, but for the storm rattling the windows. Lady Eleanor, her face ashen, was the first to speak. "Miss Parsons, do you believe the murder and the theft were committed by the same person?" Jane exhaled, considering. "Yes. The Duke's death and the disappearance of the chess set are too closely linked to be a coincidence. But what I find most interesting is that the set was never taken from Harrington Hall. That means the culprit isn't just a thief, they're playing a game." Lionel chuckled softly. "Ah, but who's winning, I wonder?" Jane ignored him and turned to Edward. "You're the Duke's heir. You had the most to gain from his death." Edward stiffened. "I resent that implication, Miss Parsons. Yes, I inherit the title and the estate, but that doesn't mean I wanted him dead." "But you argued with him," Jane pressed. "Did you not?" Edward hesitated, glancing at Lady Eleanor before answering. "We had a disagreement about the estate, about his reckless spending. He was obsessed with that chess set. I told him it was dangerous to keep such a treasure in the open, but he refused to listen." "Did you see the Duke's Gambit after dinner?" Number Y assumed it had been locked away. Jane turned next to Caldwell. "And you, Mr. Caldwell?" The businessman ran a handkerchief over his forehead. "I was in the smoking room, I swear it. I never went near the study." "You deal in investments," Jane said smoothly, "and the Duke was known for his extravagant purchases. Did he owe you money?" Caldwell hesitated, then sighed. "Yes, a substantial amount. But I wouldn't kill him over it. If anything, his death makes things worse for me. I'll have to renegotiate everything with Lord Edward now." "Unless," Jane countered, "you weren't trying to settle debts. You were trying to recover losses. The Duke's Gambit is worth a fortune. Did you intend to steal it to cover what the Duke owed you?" Caldwell's face flushed. "That's absurd." Jane studied him for a moment before moving to Count Orloff. "And you, Count? You seem remarkably calm for a man trapped in a house with a murderer." Orloff's dark eyes met hers without hesitation. "I do not fear shadows, Miss Parsons." "Then perhaps you'll explain why you were near the Duke's study shortly before his death?" A slight pause. "I was admiring the artwork." Jane arched an eyebrow. "I find it difficult to believe that you, a diplomat from Russia, came all this way just to admire British paintings." Orloff allowed himself the faintest smile. "You suspect me?" "I suspect anyone who tells me only half the truth," Jane replied. Orloff's expression remained unreadable. "Perhaps I was more interested in the Duke's Gambit than I claimed." Jane studied him. He was deliberately revealing just enough to seem honest, but not the whole story. She turned last to Lionel Harrington. "And you, Lionel? You had nothing to gain from Percival's death, yet you seem completely unbothered by it." Lionel shrugged. "You mistake indifference for amusement, Miss Parsons. I simply enjoy the chaos." "And where were you after dinner?" "Drinking, of course." "With witnesses?" "No." Jane narrowed her eyes. "How convenient." Lionel smiled. "Isn't it?" Before Jane could press further, a new sound reached their ears. Footsteps. Rapid, desperate, running. Jane spun toward the door. Someone was fleeing. Without hesitation, she bolted after them, her boots pounding against the polished floor. The others followed, a mixture of confusion and alarm. The chase led through the corridors, past the grand staircase, through the darkened halls of Harrington Hall. The figure ahead was barely visible, a shadow among shadows, slipping through doors, weaving through passageways. Jane quickened her pace. Whoever it was, they knew the house. Then, abruptly, the figure stumbled, a muffled curse. Jane lunged forward and grabbed the intruder by the arm, spinning them around. A housemaid. Her face was pale with fear, her breath coming in short gasps. Lady Eleanor gasped. "Anna?" Jane held the woman firmly. "Where were you running to?" The maid's eyes darted to the left, to a hidden door in the wall. A servant's passage. Jane followed her gaze, then looked back at the maid. "What were you trying to hide?" Anna trembled. I wasn't hiding anything, miss. I swear it." Jane tightened her grip. "Lies won't save you. Were you helping someone, or were you stealing the chess set for yourself?" Tears welled in the woman's eyes. I never stole anything, miss. I only—" She hesitated. Jane's eyes narrowed. "You know something." Then, in a whisper, the maid said, "I saw someone near the study the night the Duke died." Jane's pulse quickened. "Who?" Anna swallowed hard. I don't know his name, but—" She looked at the group behind Jane. Then slowly, her trembling finger pointed to one of them. A sharp intake of breath filled the corridor. Jane followed the maid's gaze. It was one of the 4 men. A beat of silence. Then Anna whispered, "It was him." Chapter 7. The Grand Checkmate. Jane held her breath as she followed Anna's gaze. The finger trembled slightly, but remained unwavering. She was pointing at Henry Caldwell. A ripple of unease passed through the group. Caldwell stiffened, his ruddy complexion paling. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. Jane took a slow step forward. "You saw Mr. Caldwell near the Duke's study on the night of the murder?" Anna nodded quickly, her breath shallow. I was coming up from the kitchens, miss. I wasn't supposed to be in that part of the house, but I'd taken a short-cut. I saw him coming out of the study, real quiet-like. He looked—" She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nervous." Caldwell finally found his voice. "This is nonsense. I was in the smoking room after dinner." Jane tilted her head. "Were you, or did you simply say you were?" Caldwell's face darkened. "I don't appreciate being accused by some housemaid." "She saw you," Jane said evenly, "and considering what we now know, I find it rather interesting that you would sneak out of the study that night." Lady Eleanor, her hands clutching her shawl tightly, turned to Caldwell with barely concealed fury. "Were you involved in my brother's death?" Caldwell exhaled sharply. "I did not kill him." "But you were in the study." Jane's voice was smooth, patient, relentless. Caldwell hesitated. Then, with a frustrated sigh, he raked a hand through his thinning hair. "Fine. Yes, I was there." A murmur of shock ran through the group. "I went to speak with the Duke," Caldwell admitted, "about business. I needed to discuss an urgent matter regarding an investment he made. I knew he'd be in his study, so I went to see him. But when I got there—" He hesitated again. Jane's eyes narrowed. "Yes?" Caldwell swallowed hard. "The chess set was already missing." Jane studied his face. He wasn't lying. If he was telling the truth, then the theft had occurred even earlier than she had thought. "What did the Duke say?" "He was furious," Caldwell muttered. "Told me to get out. He wasn't interested in business, not with that set missing. He said he knew exactly who took it." Jane's pulse quickened. "He knew?" Caldwell nodded. "That's what he said. I don't know if he was bluffing, or if he had real proof, but he was convinced." Jane's mind raced. If the Duke knew who had taken the chess set, then his death wasn't just about theft. It was about silencing him. "And you didn't tell anyone this earlier?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I was scared," Caldwell snapped. "And why wouldn't I be? The man was murdered that very night." "Yet you never thought to mention that he knew the identity of the thief." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. I panicked." A storm rattled the windows, as if to punctuate his words. Jane folded her arms. "Then tell me this. If you weren't the thief or the murderer, who do you think took the Duke's gambit?" Caldwell hesitated, then looked past Jane to someone else. Count Vasily Orloff. The Russian's dark eyes did not waver. "You believe I am the thief?" Orloff asked, his voice calm, unreadable. Caldwell's jaw tensed. "The Duke suspected you." Jane turned to Orloff. "And why would that be?" For the first time that evening, a flicker of something passed over the Count's face. Annoyance? Amusement? She couldn't quite tell. "I am a collector of rare artifacts," Orloff admitted smoothly, "and the Duke's gambit is one of the most extraordinary treasures in England. Naturally, I expressed an interest in it." Jane's gaze sharpened. Interest or intent? Orloff exhaled slowly. "I will not deny that I wanted it, but I did not steal it." "You expect us to believe that?" Edward scoffed. Orloff's gaze flicked to him. "Yes, because if I had stolen it, I would not have left it in this house." Jane took a slow breath, organizing her thoughts. "If not you, then who?" Another silence. Then a voice, soft but firm, broke it. "I think I know." Jane turned sharply. Lady Eleanor. She was pale, but there was something else now. Determination. Jane stepped forward. "Who?" Lady Eleanor's voice wavered only slightly. "I believe Percival's own cousin, Lionel Harrington." A stunned silence. Lionel, ever the picture of nonchalance, only smiled. "Oh, darling, I do love a dramatic accusation." But Jane could see something else now, a flicker of something not quite right behind those mocking eyes. Eleanor's voice strengthened. "My brother suspected you. That's why he was so agitated. And that's why he set up the fake chessboard in his study, because he knew the real set was gone, and he needed to send a message before it was too late." Jane studied Lionel's expression. He wasn't denying it. So she pressed forward. "You were the only person who showed no reaction to the Duke's death," she said. "The only person who made light of the whole thing. That isn't the reaction of a man shocked by murder. That's the reaction of a man who knew it was coming." Lionel's smirk faltered. Edward exhaled sharply. "You God, Lionel, you really did it?" Lionel's lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile anymore. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Edward." Jane's voice was calm but edged with steel. "You stole the Duke's gambit. You wanted the money it would bring. But then your cousin discovered the truth." Lionel tilted his head, considering. Then, after a moment, he sighed. "Well, that is an unfortunate conclusion, isn't it?" "You poisoned him," Jane continued. Lionel exhaled. "Ah, well, in my defence, he was a terrible chess player." The words were almost casual, but the room exploded into chaos. Edward lunged forward, but Jane stopped him with a sharp gesture. Lionel sighed again and leaned back against the bookcase. "It wasn't personal, you know." "Well, no, that's not quite true, is it?" He always thought himself untouchable. I wanted to prove him wrong." Jane's voice was ice. "And you were trying to retrieve the chess set tonight." Lionel smiled. "Of course. What's the point of winning if you don't claim the prize?" Jane took a step closer. "Checkmate, Mr. Harrington." Lionel chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Miss Parsons, you do make a wonderful opponent." And with that, he lifted his hands in surrender. The game was over. Epilogue: The Last Move. 2 days later, the storm had passed. The sky above Harrington Hall was a washed-out shade of blue, the morning sun casting long shadows across the dewy lawns. The grandeur of the estate remained untouched, yet a change had settled over the house, one that could not be seen but rather felt, like the lingering tension after the final move of a chess match. Lionel Harrington was gone. The local constabulary had arrived before dawn, escorting him away in a carriage bound for London. He had not struggled, nor had he pleaded his innocence. Instead, he had offered Jane Parsons a slow, knowing smile as he had been led past her. "You played well, Miss Parsons," he had murmured, "but I suspect you'll miss me." Jane had said nothing, watching as the carriage disappeared down the long drive, its wheels kicking up dust in the cold morning air. Now she stood in the Duke's study once more. It had been restored to order, no longer a crime scene, but a room haunted by its past. The Duke's Gambit had been retrieved from its hiding place behind a loose panel in the strong room where Lionel had stashed it after stealing it that night. Soon it would be placed in the estate vault, far from greedy hands. Lady Eleanor stood by the window, her eyes distant. "It feels strange," she murmured, "knowing he's gone, knowing Percival is gone." Jane turned to her. Lionel was right about one thing. Eleanor looked at her sharply. "He said your brother thought himself untouchable." Jane sighed. That was his mistake. He believed his wealth and power could protect him from betrayal. But in the end, it wasn't an outsider who killed him. It was family. Eleanor exhaled, her fingers tightening on the lace handkerchief in her grasp. "Do you think he ever suspected Lionel before that night?" Jane considered. Perhaps. But if he had, he underestimated how far Lionel was willing to go. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Eleanor turned, her expression softening. "I never properly thanked you, Miss Parsons." Jane offered a small smile. "No thanks are necessary. Just promise me you'll have that chess set locked away before someone else gets ideas." Eleanor let out a soft laugh. "That I can do." A knock at the door interrupted them. Lord Edward Pembroke stepped inside, his usually severe features softer than before. "Miss Parsons," he said, clearing his throat, "I must also extend my gratitude. Without you, we might have never uncovered the truth." Jane inclined her head. "Justice was served, Lord Pembroke. That's what matters." Edward hesitated. "I know you must be eager to return to London, but I was wondering, would you consider staying for a few more days?" Jane raised an eyebrow. "Is this an invitation or a request for me to ensure no more aristocrats are plotting murder?" Edward smiled. "A bit of both, I suppose." Jane chuckled. "Tempting, but I believe my work here is done." She turned toward the door, then hesitated, glancing back at the chessboard on the Duke's desk. The final position remained just as it had been found. The captured Black Queen set aside, the White King clenched in his dying hand. A message. Jane reached out and moved the White King into checkmate. "The last move," she murmured. With that she left the room, stepping out into the crisp morning air.